Let me welcome everyone. My name is Joe Liu. I'm President and CEO of the Coalition for Clean Air, and we're really glad you could join us this morning. We see that we have a lot of friends here and more joining by the moment. And we appreciate that you've started your Friday morning with us. The purpose for us to be here today is to discuss carbon emissions in the building trade. And it's one of these key issues that we must address in order to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And if we're being honest about it, just to save the world. So this event has been made possible through the generous sponsorship of Skanska. And Skanska is one of the world's largest project development and construction companies. And they're known for their dedication to building a better society, like we're talking about today. So if you haven't joined us before, this is one in a series of events we call Clean Air Conversations, and hosted by the Coalition for Clean Air, where we have the privilege of waking up every day and, what happened there? My screen just changed. Okay. We have the privilege of waking up every day and working to protect public health, improve air quality, and prevent climate change. That was an interesting sound. That wasn't on my end. I'm not sure what that was. Anyway, what to expect today, other than people dropping dishes. After I go through a few housekeeping items, we'll see a short set of slides that Thunder will launch for us about Coalition for Clean Air. And we'll get to our panel discussion, which will be moderated by Climate Resolve's Bryn Lindblad. Thank you, Bryn. And you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists and post them in the chat. And you will get that opportunity to participate in this. And then once we do the Q&A, we'll get a short update from Coalition for Clean Air Policy Director Bill Mcgavern, who will let us know what the status of Coalition for Clean Air's advocacy efforts is so far this year and what our goals are. He'll go through that real quickly. We'll wrap up with an important Save the Date announcement from our development director, Brian Sheridan. But before we do all that, let me go through the housekeeping items. So we recommend that you use speaker view during the event, which is if you go on, mostly I think everyone, you go on the top right corner and click on view, you select speaker view, then you'll be seeing the person who's talking. You can toggle back and forth if you want. You all have the capability of unmuting yourself, but we ask if you're not speaking, please stay muted. Karen, our events manager, has the capability and will use it if you're providing background noise, and she will mute you. But please mute yourself so she doesn't have to. Use the chat, please, to communicate with anyone. You can actually, the reason that you can unmute yourself is we have to set it up this way so you can do private chatting with people and friends who you see here with us today on the participants list. We are recording this event, so please don't say or do anything that you don't want the whole world to hear or see. Well, I think we'll end up posting it on our website, maybe on our YouTube channel and things like that. And I think that's it for me in terms of updates. Karen or Brian, did I miss anything? No? Okay. Then Thunder, I think we can go to the slides. Thank you.
When the Coalition for Clean Air was founded in 1971, Californians breathed some of the smoggiest air in the world. So we got to work. We led the charge for California's smog check program for passenger vehicles, a program that reduces 100 tons of automobile pollution every day. We cleaned up school buses so that kids don't get sick. We got the toxic chemical perc out of dry cleaning. And in 2019, we followed up with SB 210, a similar smog check program for heavy-duty freight, which will result in emissions reductions equivalent to taking hundreds of thousands of trucks off California roads. But we're not resting on our laurels. With your help, we're fighting to eliminate diesel use in California, to bring millions of Californians together to clear the air each California Clean Air Day, to decarbonize our economy and meet our climate goals, and to deliver healthy air to all Californians in the next decade.
Brian, I think this one's you. You were going to introduce.
Thanks, Joe. So I just want to thank everybody for being here again. Thanks, Skanska, for supporting this clean air conversation. You know, I've had the pleasure of knowing, getting to know Ben and Bryn over the past, 6 years or so. And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the issue that we're going to talk about today, that within the context of the Los Angeles, NGO community, they know their stuff. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on their bios. You can find links to them on our website, but I'm excited to have Bryn moderate and Ben on the panel. I don't know Stacy as well, but I do hope to get to know her. And, again, when it comes to, a level of expertise on the subject of embodied carbon, if you Google Stacy's name, she's going to come up a million times. So including several really good interviews that I encourage everybody to look at on that subject. But, just in the context of the Coalition for Clean Air, we have fought for innumerable policies over our 50-year history. And it's always the kind of folks that are sort of the leaders in the area that had to bring it to our attention to sort of know the subject matter and really dive in. And so this is one of those areas where I think we're going to find that. So I'm really excited about the conversation today. And like Joe was saying, please do ask questions, connect with folks on LinkedIn, etc. The other thing I'd just like to ask of everybody, if this is your third, I'm just always curious about return visitors, click one of the various reactions if you have been to our, one of these before. I always like to see how many repeat visitors we have, as demonstrated by Thunder Dawn and Janet. But, with no further ado, I will turn it over to Bryn, and, Bryn, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be with all of you this morning. Thanks everyone for tuning in. As Brian said, I'm Bryn Lindblad. I'm the Deputy Director of Climate Resolve. So zooming in from Los Angeles here. I'm really looking, there's nothing we love like a good problem solving session. And so I think that's kind of what we're up to this morning. So we're going to try to unfold some of the challenge that lays before us with embodied carbon. I'm really looking forward to our esteemed panelists weighing in and shining some light on what some of the solution paths forward might be. Welcome people putting in the chat sort of observations, comments, insights you're having along the way, and questions too. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So please feel welcome to engage with the topic. All right, to start us off, I'm just going to frame up our issue a little bit here. There was a slide from Skanska on that opening part, which really helped give a little bit of an overview too. But this morning, we're talking about embedded carbon, sometimes called embodied carbon. So that's really, it's the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the materials and the construction processes in the building sector. So that's the mining, the refining, the manufacturing, transportation, and the installation of materials in that construction process. So sometimes we call that scope cradle to site. If you're familiar with like cradle to cradle, we're talking about from the birth of these materials to them landing at the site and being installed in buildings and structures. And sometimes embodied carbon, we can also look at the emissions that are associated with materials at the end of their useful life, once they've become waste. And so then we call that cradle to grave. But let's distinguish this embodied carbon concept from the idea of operational carbon. And so operational carbon is when we look at like the energy use of the building during its useful life, after it's constructed and it's being used. So both embodied carbon and operational carbon, they're both important, and we need to be decarbonizing in both those areas. But up until now, the focus really has been a lot on operational carbon and energy efficiency of the buildings. And it's just recently that there's beginning to be more attention paid to embodied carbon. So that's what we're trying to kind of unfold and work through a little bit here today, this morning. And a little bit why we care about this. IPCC has warned us that we need to be a net zero carbon world by 2050. I'm glad to see Skanska went up that a little bit and try to hit that mark by 2045. And we can't delay, right? 50% of those emissions reductions need to happen by 2030, because the more carbon we keep putting up into the atmosphere, it accumulates up there. So we can't just kind of keep putting it up there and wait to solve the problem until later. And when we look at the building sector, globally, that's about 40% of our GHG emissions each year, which is pretty significant. And about a third of that, 40%, is coming from embedded carbon, whereas the other 2/3 are from operational carbon. Another way to look at that, global emissions, just the embodied carbon in buildings is about 11% of our total greenhouse gas inventory worldwide. And unfold that a little bit more, kind of how can we address that, that 11% of embodied carbon emissions? Out of that embodied carbon, 80% of those emissions are coming from just 3 materials alone. So it's concrete, iron, and steel are really high embodied carbon content materials. So here we are today in 2021, and we have a good understanding. We're aware of the problem, and fortunately, we're standing on the shoulders of some giants that have gotten to us where we are today. And so by that, I mean we've got a pretty dang robust digital database of environmental product declarations, EPDs, sometimes they're called for short. And so those are third-party verified certificate, understandings of the full environmental footprint of various materials, products that are out on the market. And part of that disclosure of kind of what that footprint is, include a life cycle analysis of the embodied carbon content of those materials. And so that's reported usually there as global warming potential. All right, so that's kind of where we are today. My first question for our panelists, and let's start with you, Ben, if we look at the tools that are out there today to access those EPDs, those environmental product declarations, and see the embedded carbon information that's on those EPDs, do you have a favorite tool out there, and how easy are they to use? Are there some tools that are better than others, and why?
Thank you, Bryn, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to mention my favorite tool, but that's really going to be a sort of a soft lob to Stacy, because there's really one tool that I think has really kind of taken this whole issue and really provided people with the kind of transparency they need to make decisions. And I do want to emphasize a point here, and that's really around transparency. So much of what we deal with in the sustainability world is when we get visibility to data, then we go through sort of shock and awe, and then we figure out how to deal with it. And the movement that's been nice to see over the last, really the last 3 years in earnest, but it's taken longer than that to get to this point, is having that transparency around materials. What goes into their manufacturing process. What is that carbon footprint of that material when it gets to a site? As you said earlier. And the reality is that most people haven't had the ability to make decisions using tools like the EC3 tool that I'm about to hand over to Stacy to introduce a little bit more. But having that transparency allows people who are making decisions anyway on projects to be more educated, to look at different products, whether it's concrete or steel or glass or roofing. There's you can go as deep as you can get information and find things that are going to reduce the overall footprint of that project. And this is a big deal. I mean, even just by paying attention to this, people can make an impact right away. They can typically be cost neutral. And if they can go dig deeper and go further, they can make even more headway. And I think this can really spur a change in our supply chain around buildings overall. So coming back to your question on tools, the EC3 tool is a phenomenal tool. It works with a variety of databases that feed EPD information into it. And we put on some training ourselves here through USGBC LA in the last year and a half or so. We put on 2 or 3 different trainings to provide opportunities for people to learn. And I'm sure Stacy's only done 150 of them in the last year. So Stacy, I don't know if you want to talk a little about the EC3 tool and what it does, but I do think it's pretty groundbreaking in letting people address this issue.
Please,
And
Stacy, yeah.
you want me to
let's
go?
hear it. Yeah. You speak a little bit about the tools application. I'm curious to hear people trained up and using it, kind of how mainstream is its use by now?
Sure. Yeah. So just to kind of give everyone kind of the grounding. So these environmental product declarations historically are being created as PDF documents. So they're a multi-page PDF document that's got a table that gives you that kilogram of CO2 equivalent per unit that we need to do this carbon estimating and comparison. And I at Skanska, a handful of years ago, was trying to go source these PDFs from websites, download them as PDFs, look through them and find the table, and then put all that information into a spreadsheet to do comparisons and analysis. And came up with the idea that, if we could digitize all of these EPDs into a database where it's just a few clicks to do that, gosh, that would help me, but it might also help other people. So that's really where EC3 came from, was this need for the data to be easily accessible from these declarations. And then Skanska seed funded the development of EC3 to really show that we could digitize all this data and use it. So EC3 is free. It's a free tool. It lives at a nonprofit called Building Transparency that was established once the tool was launched. So if you go to buildingtransparency.org, anyone can just register for free and start doing digging into the data, which is, I think, one of the things that's important, is just easy access and free access to the data. It was launched publicly in 2019 in November at the Greenbuild conference. And since then, it's grown to 13,000 registered users as of last week. And if we start looking at how many people are searching the EPD databases over the past 6 months, 28,000 searches of the concrete EPD database have happened. And it's just, again, this kind of, I joke it's the curve I don't want to flatten. It just keeps on going up and up in terms of who's using the data now that they know it's there. So I would just urge everyone to go start digging in and getting educated and looking in the material categories and starting to look at that carbon data in the tool.
It's great to hear people are in there and searching and looking in the database. Can I hear a little bit, if anyone has a take on how useful that tool has been to influence material decisions, and if there's any examples you can share of a project that's changed it and been impacted, changed its scope based on kind of being able to look at that embodied carbon and materials. Would love to hear that sort of on a real world experience. Brian, any story to share?
I'll probably let Stacy again go first here, because she has such good visibility with the tool itself, and then I can talk about sort of the experience of what I hear from architects and engineers and others. But Stacy probably has some pretty interesting case studies that she can reference from her vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, we've got pilot partners like Microsoft and other large companies that have committed to using the tool on projects and are getting through the process. Skanska is building it into all of our pre-construction efforts here in the Washington office, and then looking at it nationally for concrete first. And what we're finding is when you use the data to help inform decisions, when you're using it at this decision-making point, so you can go in and say, I have these 3 suppliers that I could use. Do they have EPDs? Yes, they do. How are they comparing in their carbon content? And either be able to just require EPDs and use that carbon disclosure at time of bid to help inform your choice when you're looking at cost and carbon. Looking at putting that process in place for concrete where we have adoption. And I will tell you that California is one of the places where we do have really good adoption from the concrete suppliers. So there's good data there for concrete. The same is true for Washington, where we've got thousands of mixed specific EPDs. The suppliers will give us the carbon and the cost data competitively, and we're typically seeing about a 30% emission swing between suppliers based on them optimizing mixes or not. And typically I think actually now in all cases so far that I've seen, the lowest cost bidder is the lowest carbon emitter, because they're competing on both, and as they're optimizing their mixes, it might actually be less expensive versus more based on what they're doing. So that 30% reduction across really all materials seems to be what's possible right now in the supply chain if you have the data available to you at little to no cost.
Yeah, and then I can, just building on her statement a little bit, feedback we get, from architects and engineers is, overall, this has really opened their eyes on what they can do. So when they're making specification decisions on projects, they will try to do those for those who are, more sustainably minded. The bigger issue, I think, is that, the large corporate portfolio owners, the REITs and the developers are making these commitments now to really look at embodied carbon. It's been around, long enough now where at first it was only, just the really, really cool kids were doing it. And now those who are really trying to be more in the mainstream of what's happening in sustainability or looking critically at what their corporate sustainability initiatives are saying, what are we doing, about embodied carbon? And so they're putting that pressure then on the people who are working for them to develop their projects, the architects, engineers who are doing the work. And that's really, really important. And I think overall, what the feedback we're getting from a lot of these companies is that, they're always trying to find ways to try to reach their ESG goals, their corporate sustainability goals. And this is providing them another tool that they didn't necessarily have that's really helping them get there a little bit faster. At the same time, it's also creating awareness for them, kind of what they weren't doing before, and how bad their footprint might have been. And here in California, we have some legislation that was passed a few years ago called the Buy Clean California Act. We've done work for a few years on a grant to support sort of the rollout of that. As part of that, we worked with Stacy and her team and the Carbon Leadership Forum to develop a layer in the EC3 tool and in one of the EPD databases where people could actually check a box to say, is this covered under the Buy Clean California Act or not? Buy Clean California covered structural steel, roofing material, some insulation, and structural glass. Concrete was left out last minute, which really was a result of lobbying, I'm sure, as things got across the finish line. The good news is there's a big push to update the Buy Clean California legislation this year, which we're very supportive of, where it would include concrete. And now we have a lot of great options, as Stacy said, from concrete suppliers here in California. They've been predominantly located in Northern California, but we've seen some encouraging signs here in Southern California. We've got a few plants now that are going to be coming online with reduced emission product here locally. And another big thing around this, I think, is really figuring out where we set our emissions threshold. What are the levels where we're going to make a decision on a product? What is too high? It's one thing to be looking at the information, but it's another thing to make a decision on, okay, where are we drawing the line on emissions for a particular type of product? And that's hopefully what the legislation will help address this year as well.
And we started to dive into a couple topics I wanted to get into. Let's talk next about the development sector and kind of the demand is there. You spoke a little bit that maybe the number of cool kids out there is growing, that it's not such a small group anymore. But can we talk a little bit more about, if the demand is there, if you're finding the development sector asking for lower embodied carbon materials in the buildings?
Yeah, I was a little hard to hear you there, but I think you want to ask about the demand on the volume, basically, for embodied carbon materials. That's a big part of what legislation on state level is really about. I mean, by requiring publicly funded projects to have EPDs, essentially, that's really meant to force suppliers, if they have big scale demand that's going to force them to get EPDs, they're going to have to change their practices and start to provide those. And that's really part of why that legislation was passed initially, is to put the pressure on the manufacturers. We do need to do more of that. You may be happy to know the city of LA also adopted Buy Clean on a local level as part of the update to the Sustainable City Plan. I think that was last year. Seems like an eon ago. I mean, it feels like it was 3 years ago, but it may have just been last year. And that's important because, again, that kind of puts that pressure on folks. Although the devil is always in the details and on implementation. And that's one of the challenges we've had on a state level with the current legislation, is that it was really kind of allowing every specifier to really determine kind of what was their own emissions threshold. And it created a lot of confusion around how it was rolled out. There was also some discrepancies about what products were included and what weren't, including like certain types of insulation or others. So, I think what's driving demand right now is, you have that public procurement. We have a ton of large projects here in LA. Now we're having the demand from the folks who do have sustainability standards about how they do things, whether they're big corporates like the Microsofts and the Googles, or the more progressive REITs like the Kilroys and the Hudson Pacifics. They're making sure they're looking at those sorts of things when they're making decisions. And so all those things put pressure on the market. As you would imagine, the manufacturers have been slow to adopt in many cases, although for those that have a lower environmental impact, it's really helpful because it can help make them more competitive. And I think overall, this opens up a big opportunity for more localized sourcing. And there's an economic development opportunity here when we look at the embodied carbon of bringing in steel from China versus steel from the US, well, steel from the US is going to have a lower environmental footprint because of that, that transportation cost. Obviously, you have to look at the manufacturing process itself as well, but there's a big advantage there for local products. Same thing can be said of other products like sourcing wood locally, rock. As you start to get those EPDs and look at that transportation cost, one of the things we want to do here at USGBC LA is actually develop a database of localized materials that people can look at that has the environmental information, the EPD information, but also is giving people that sort of certainty of, oh, we've got reduced transportation costs to get that product to site. So I think that's a pretty big deal. But I'm sure Stacy can also talk to demand. I mean, just based on what she's saying about how people are using the tool, and I'm sure Skanska is bidding lots of projects where this is a big factor.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're doing at Building Transparency, I guess I wear two hats. Skanska is actually supporting me as the executive director of that nonprofit to help with continue the management of EC3. And through the nonprofit, we are working with a group we've called Owners Carbon Action Network, or Owners Can. And there's, I think, 18 owners as a part of that group. We meet every 2 weeks, and it spans higher ed, tech, healthcare, kind of commercial, all sorts of different brands and owners are there. And what we're doing is developing an actual process document that the owners want to be able to say, this is how we're all approaching embodied carbon. This is what we're going to be asking for. This is what you're going to see in your RFPs and your contract documents, and then publish that so that it's aligned to ask industry. I think we've learned a lot from other things and been talked to some of the confusion that things can raise if you're doing it 20 different ways. So I think there's just a big effort from owners who have done a lot of other sustainability work and are now focused on embodied carbon to try to align and come together, and we're helping to push that forward. And then I think I had a call this morning with a manufacturer that was like, we're seeing EC3 being required in our specs and that we have EPDs and we're higher than our one of our competitors. And what do we do? How prevalent is this? We want to go make sure we're making the business case to lower the carbon of our products if this is going to stick around. So that's really the loop that we want to see and that we're starting to see, is it making its way to the manufacturers in a way where it's a signal that now they've disclosed now, this is going to happen, it's going to be required, but now they need to compete. How do they start investing in innovation to lower the carbon emissions of their products? So it's just a really exciting time. It's, to Ben's point, it feels like 2 years has been 10 years in terms of the speed that embodied carbon has become more of a known impact, but also the action that's happening. And, I think just Skanska is seeing it come from owners, and we're pushing it back up to our owners, but also down to our suppliers, and just making sure everyone understands this is something that we're going to all have to be addressing.
Thanks for that. No, it's great to hear that. Yeah, development sector is proving that there's a demand, and that it's possible, and sort of getting some buildings out there showing that it's not such a stretch. So Stacy, you alluded that the writing's on the wall, that this is coming. You're going to have to do this. So let's talk a little bit about regulation and mandates, and if there's if we're ready for policy to be requiring in a building code a certain level of embodied carbon reduction. So we've seen the federal government recently consider setting a standard that 75% of the materials used in federal building construction will need to have lower embodied carbon content. There's a building code in Marin County that also requires that all concrete used there be lower embodied carbon content. So can I get your take of whether you think the LA City building code is ready for an update of that sort, or would you rather see the California building code incorporate embodied carbon? Let's go to Stacy first this time.
Sure. Yeah. So I think just generally just the landscape of policy right now, as you mentioned, it goes all the way from kind of city, county, all the way up to federal at the current moment. So we've seen policies and climate action plans at the county level. We've seen code requirements at the city level around things like low carbon concrete. We've seen code at the state level around low carbon concrete. We've seen code at the state level, or policy at the state level for Buy Clean, that's kind of taking what's happening in California and building on it in multiple states. And then we've also seen the House Clean Future Act come out that at the national federal level would require, would be a Buy Clean procurement policy that would require EPDs, and then over time set thresholds, and even have a climate star type rating for the lowest 10 or 20% of products, kind of similar to Energy Star. So all of that's happening. There's language that you can reference or look at all those different levels when it comes to either Buy Clean or kind of performance or prescriptive code for some of this. I know there's also work being done at the IBC level in terms of if there could be code in the building code there. So yes, I think it's time. We have the data we need to help inform some of that. We've done things out of EC3 where we just extract all of the data for a category, so people can start to use Excel to set limits and filter and sort by regions and things to help inform those codes. Yeah, I don't think there's any really big challenges right now. We're at a point where I think what I would say is the more that we can align these codes and make sure that they are similar, so that when you're doing a project in LA, you don't have one building code, a different Buy Clean policy that have different requirements that make things really difficult or challenging. So how can we make sure that everyone's talking and sharing how they're writing these things into policy?
Ben, do you have a take on where do we set that threshold? What's the right, how do we structure that lower embodied carbon mandate in a building?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stacy's 100% right. Nothing's more challenging for people who are building buildings than when you do a building here in LA and the code is entirely different than someplace else you go to, and the products have to go through an entirely different process. And that kind of frustration really just those challenges really just frustrate developers and frustrate builders and have them not want to do things that could be good for the environment. So the way LA really adopted Buy Clean last year was they just said, we agree with the state of California's limits that they've put on things and what they're covering with their Buy Clean legislation. I think that's kind of a good way to do it. I think what I would like to see is the state of California, update their Buy Clean legislation this year, get a better process in place, include more products, get some standards there. And then that way local jurisdictions can then just opt in to really follow what the state is putting out there for their own projects. So the key thing with the Buy Clean code is that just covers public, procurement. So state of California, so Caltrans, the UC systems, people who are using state funding to build things. When the city agrees to adopt that, they're saying, well, when things are built with city funds, we're going to adopt that. So the nice thing is that, it'd be great to see groups like, LA County Metro adopt that. Other big folks where they can just lean on what the state is doing. From a federal standpoint, it's I don't know. I feel like it's so tough to have visibility to what's going on a federal level. And when things do get passed on that federal level, how long will that take to roll out on the state level, then on a county and city level? So I think the nice thing here in California is that we tend to lead the way. And, we have this moment right now, frankly, where we've got legislation that's being put forward. We should really lean into trying to get that passed in a way that can be productive for our state. And California was the first state to pass Buy Clean legislation. I know Washington's been looking at it as well. So we should continue to try to lead here and get some standards there.
Great. Yeah, no, I can understand it would be frustrating with her to be meeting different standards. I was hearing Stacy say earlier that the cost difference, often it's cost saving to go for these lower embedded carbon materials. Are there any trade-offs, any sort of what changes about a building, any sort of different design considerations, anything that's harder to make work, or is it kind of all green signals?
So I think there's various places within design and procurement where you can inform or reduce emissions. The first is, before we get to this we're looking at everything through the lens of specs and procurement. When you know what you're building out of, you can make low carbon choices. But before that, early design assessment using life cycle assessment to look at, timber versus steel and constructability, and can I reduce the size of my building? Can I use less materials? All of that's also very important. And that's really where you want to look at what's possible, what will code allow me to do, how much timber can I use, you know, is it going to take me longer to build or less time to build, is there a cost increase to a different system? That all happens kind of pre this EC3 EPD conversation, but is also important. When it comes to trade-offs, I think I wouldn't call it trade-offs, but it's just I think there's an urgency around carbon because of climate and because of all of these commitments that are coming out where we're saying we're going to get to zero. So we have to focus on this now. We don't have much time, but we can't forget about all the work that we've done to date around health and air quality and all these things that also we need to make sure we're looking at with materials. You know, so I think that's just something that we're constantly trying to keep in mind is that, yes, carbon's urgent. Climate is urgent, but as we're looking at these low carbon options, what are the ingredients they're using to make these materials? Are we putting a lower carbon but higher toxicity material in place? We don't want to do that. So we just need to keep that awareness in mind as we continue down this path.
Yeah, there's been a lot of effort developing LEED standards and living challenge and other building certifications. And now the net zero idea is more about the operational carbon. So can I get your take? Is there room for, do we want a sort of standalone voluntary standard that's only about embodied carbon, or would you rather see it kind of looped into one of these more holistic frameworks?
Ben, I don't know if you want to take that first, but I have thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give my answer and welcome your thoughts, but you know, frankly, I think again, I want to get back to simplifying things for people who are using standards. Look, all of these standards, frankly, need to evolve as the market evolves, right? You know, we're always finding new ways to reduce, whether it's our carbon impact from our buildings or just create greener buildings overall. And so, you know, I would love to see the current standards that are there really lean in to embodied carbon and embrace what's happening. You know, I'm supportive of anything and any standard that helps us create, you know, more sustainable buildings and then more sustainable communities. But I do think we should really try to work embodied carbon in so that messaging is clear for folks. We already have the systems in place to roll those things out, and that'll help move the market forward faster.
Yeah, and I was going to say a similar thing. I think that, you know, we've got zero carbon certification from the Living Future Institute that looks at operational embodied. We've got the Living Building Challenge that includes embodied carbon. We've got LEED that does have embodied carbon in both a life cycle assessment credit and the pilot credit that we helped develop for the procurement side. My hope would be that, you know, I think it's 5 points total that you can get in LEED for embodied carbon reductions, and how many for operational energy, Ben? Like almost 20.
Yeah, I was going to say at least 3 or 4 times that probably.
Yeah. So if it's really 50-50, how do we kind of create a, you know, an equity in the LEED rating system to look at both? And I think, you know, that's what the versions of LEED start to do. We can iterate and start to address these things so we know more what we need to be tackling. So yes, less is more in terms of number of certifications, but let's just get them to really incorporate embodied carbon at the level that they should.
I think the time has come for us to turn to some questions from the audience. Brian, did you want to ask yours out loud?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering what, you know, I know we talk a lot about carbon, but, and I think Stacy actually kind of answered this, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the emissions co-benefits of moving to, you know, a full life cycle, you know, analysis and adoption. If you guys have any info on that.
So what I would say is that because carbon is the largest piece, but the way that it's a CO2 equivalent, a global warming potential number, where it's trying to bring in some of those other things into that number. I don't want to get into all of the scientific math and detail. If you go look up global warming potential, it will tell you how that number is calculated and what it includes. And directionally, if you're reducing carbon, you tend to be reducing some of those other things. They're just different types of gases, some that are more mixed locally, and carbon, of course, is global. What we're seeing at Skanska is like the particulates and other things that really gets into our fuels. So we're also looking at renewable diesel and other fuel types that, thankfully, California's policies that have passed have helped that make that cost competitive for us in our California market, and how we can push that into other markets. And that's really where I think it becomes more holistic, right? Where you're doing what you can at the manufacturing side, but then you're also looking at what those kind of localized emissions are during construction and transportation.
And if I could build a little bit on what what Stacy said, I think, the overall goal here is transparency. And when people are looking at their materials on this level, they're going to have transparency around not only the emissions footprint, but what's going into these materials. There'll be more scrutiny around the chemicals and other things that are used to produce materials that go on site. And I think that's a big deal. I know, Brian, you and I have talked quite a bit about indoor air quality over the last year and a half or so since we did our thought leadership series event on that. And that's a place where, I'm hopeful that this kind of visibility in the materials will just help open more, hearts and minds to the fact that we need to be paying more attention to what goes into our building materials and how that impacts indoor air quality. It's not necessarily just about certain, red list chemicals or things like that. It's also about the systems we're putting in place and ventilation. How does that interact with outdoor air quality? But the more I've dove into indoor air quality, I've been blown away about the lack of building level data for what air quality is like in our buildings, how little we know really about how materials break down in a way that impacts indoor air quality after 30, 40, 50 years. And we have so many systems, especially here in LA, that are less well maintained and are, we have kids in classrooms where they were designed for, 25 kids and now there's 40 in that classroom. And so we really need to take, I think, a closer look at indoor air quality. And I think that relates quite a bit with this movement around embodied carbon, and just overall, we need transparency, we need thoughtfulness as we approach how we build our buildings, what we're building them with, and how it's going to impact the people inside of them.
I like this question that's just coming from Carl, asking, how long are we expecting our buildings to serve us? Because when we're doing renovations and trying to repurpose the use of buildings, right, there's a footprint, an embodied carbon footprint in that. So can you share, is there any, as we're looking at lower embodied carbon materials, is there any downside on durability or anything that we need to be looking at there of kind of how long these buildings can serve us?
Yes, those are really getting into the use phase emissions. It's the stage B of embodied carbon. Embodied carbon's got an A, B, and a C stage. So stage B is use and replacement. So thinking about how many times you're going to replace that material, if it's a carpet or resilient flooring or a wall panel or something over the lifetime of the building. And you need to multiply that carbon content by that number of replacements to actually really understand what that full carbon value is for a material. We're talking a lot with owners about, when you're looking at materials, thinking about, can you specify a longer replacement cycle? And how do you start to forecast out, this is what I'm going to actually mandate now, instead of redoing things every 5 years because I want it to be purple instead of blue. So I think that's part of it. Yeah, I think also I talked about the different processes and the stages where you can impact. I mean, really the first thing you should do when you're starting a project is, do I need to build the building at all? You can reduce your emissions the most by just not building a new building. So there's lots of analysis that you can now do too, or you could say, if I build a new building, it's this much. And of course, that concrete steel is the biggest impact. If I renovate the building I have, it's tiny. So doing those analysis and really thinking through that first question of, do I need to build a new building? I think is also important.
Yeah, and I would add maybe a couple things to Stacy's comments, because she's absolutely spot on in that we need to look at also how, in some cases we still need to either update or build a building, but how do we reuse what's on site as much as possible? Again, those materials have already been created. How can we reduce our need for new materials, and starting to think more, I think, about the end of the useful life of these things. We had a panel with a group from the Netherlands. I think that was the very end of 2019. We had a group that came over and we were talking about waste, and they have a very innovative project they're doing there, where they're actually doing an inventory of the building materials in their existing buildings throughout the city. And a lot of that, they're using data looking at, what kind of materials were used during certain years when buildings were built. But they're also requiring people who are building new buildings to sort of register what materials went into it. So they're going to have this sort of constant database of what are the materials that are out there in the buildings that are in the city. Now, probably much easier to do that on a smaller level on a pilot than it would be for, a huge sprawling metropolis like we are here in LA. But just that concept of like, wait a minute, we have all these mined materials that are already in use. How can we think about those as something that are of value? And I don't remember the exact estimate the team from the Netherlands had, but basically they were like, look, we have billions of dollars of materials and useful resources around us already in the form of these buildings. that could be repurposed at any point in time. And I thought that was a really powerful sort of movement. I don't think we're there yet here, but I think starting to have that concept of like, okay, now we have all this visibility, this data that Stacy's talking about from EC3, you have that once the building's built because you've done that modeling. What do we do then with that data afterwards and on those materials, and thinking about 40 years from now, 100 years from now, if that's to live in some sort of living database, going to that first to say, okay, where can we source materials as opposed to creating new ones?
Nice. One comment, I think, because it kind of closes that as we wrap up, but I think that, that gets into the end of life, and there's forecasting what's going to happen. But, Skanska, when we go into a project, we're demolishing a building before we build a new one. And there's now examples around projects where we're thinking about it. We're taking out ceiling tiles, we're reaching out to ceiling tile manufacturers. They take those tiles back because we take them out in a way that makes sense. They then recycle those ceiling tiles back into new ceiling tiles, which means they're reducing the emissions of their new product because they're using stuff that already exists. We've done that with carpet too. I think there's lots of opportunity there just to think about the building you are taking down right now and circularity and where those materials can go, because that also, it's a loop. It reduces the emissions of the new stuff.
Love that, closing the loop, and yeah, finding uses for recycled material content, repurposing. All right, we need to be wrapping up soon, but let's let Stacy and Ben both have an opportunity for any closing comments. Ben, let's start with you.
Overall, I just would come back to this theme of transparency and awareness and knowledge, and that everything's connected. And so, we have this moment in time now where we can really advocate for our state to pass this buy clean legislation. I believe it's AB 1365, proposed by Bonta. It's been put forward to update that. So I would just track that and be aware. And then also just make sure you're asking those questions when you're touching a real estate project, or you're someone who's in that space. Oh, are you looking at embodied carbon? Oh, have you considered the embodied carbon of this project? Asking those questions will cause people to kind of go down that own personal journey and exploration of getting to a place of transparency. And that's really what we need, because the tools are there now. They just need to be used more.
Great. Stacy, any parting words to leave our audience with?
No, just that I use an analogy of tipping points, because we've got the climate challenge of negative tipping points where we go into feedback loops and stuff. But I think that we are at a positive tipping point with embodied carbon. So as more people start to use this information, the faster we can kind of balance those things. And I would just say, please go to buildingtransparency.org and register for EC3 and get familiar with it, so you can advocate for policies and be smart about knowing that the data is there, and start to use it. That's what it's there for.
Well, thank you to both of our panelists, bright leaders. I'm really glad to have you join us this morning. And I think I'm passing it back to Bill Mcgavern then.
Thanks a lot, Bryn, and thanks, Ben and Stacy. I'm Bill Mcgavern, Coalition for Clean Air Policy Director, and I just want to give a very brief update. We have got a lot going on right now in the regulatory arena with legislation and at the budget at the state level. The South Coast Air Quality Management District is facing a major decision next month on reducing diesel pollution associated with warehouses. And so that's really a top priority for us, cleaning up the trucks that are serving those warehouses, as well as the cargo handling equipment and other ways that warehouses can reduce pollution. The California Air Resources Board also has a major regulatory decision next month on the Clean Mile Standard, which will be the first rule anywhere in the country to reduce the emissions from the ride-hailing fleets like Uber and Lyft. And we really like the proposal that's before the board. In the state capitol, this is a very busy time of year where legislators are considering both the budget as well as a lot of policy bills. Governor Newsom in January proposed prioritizing the budget for zero emission vehicles. He has a $1.5 billion proposal. At that time, that looked ambitious because we didn't know how much money the state was going to have. We found out since then that the state budget is actually in very good shape, and there's money coming in from the federal government. So it may actually be appropriate to raise that target and invest more in our zero emission vehicles and the infrastructure to fuel those vehicles, so that we can reduce emissions in our sector that has the highest air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions which is the transportation sector. We're also active on a whole slew of policy bills, and since we're short on time and I don't want to hit you with a blitz of bill numbers, I'll just give you some of the themes, but you can find out the bill numbers if you go to our website, ccair.org, and look at the blog section. We have a series of 3 blogs where we cover these bills, but essentially there are a lot of opportunities to streamline the permitting process for the charging infrastructure, to incentivize clean cars and clean trucks, and also to reduce the miles traveled by our vehicles on the road in California. And we're also supporting legislation to add a couple environmental justice seats to the South Coast Air Quality Management District, something that we think would really improve representation and decision-making on that important board. So with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you.
Well, let me just thank everybody on behalf of the Coalition for Clean Air. Thanks for the thumb, Eli. And Bryn and Ben and Stacy, really appreciate you guys being a part of this. It's our 50th anniversary, and you guys saw a slide earlier. We will be celebrating on June 17th. So I hope everyone will be there. I think we have these very serious conversations as we had today. But sometimes we need to look back and see recognize the progress. So I hope everybody will be there. You were given an option to donate to the Coalition for Clean Air when you guys came on. In honor of our anniversary, for $19.71. So I hope that folks will take us up on that. And we also have a couple of other really amazing nonprofits with us today. Hopefully, folks will connect after this, because that is the purpose of these clean air conversations. And please do, follow what's going on with CCA and get involved. The other thing I'll just flag for you is that California Clean Air Day is going to be October 6th. We had 528 organizational partners of all types last year. We're going for 1,000 this year. So I hope if anybody didn't participate, that you will participate. It's a great, lift all boats celebration. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe. And thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, not much else to say other than thank you for participating. Thank you again to Bryn, Ben, and Stacy. And of course to Karen, Bill, Brian for making this happen. We really appreciate the fact we've had this kind of community of people participating in our Clean Air Conversation series. My takeaways is, think about the concrete, iron, steel, because that's a big issue in construction and building and embedded carbon. And don't forget about the value of the building not built. That was something that was really pretty interesting, and the longevity of the buildings and extending the life of buildings as key ways of reducing carbon. So I love to learn, and this is an area where I have to admit that I have a lot to learn still, because I'm focusing on air quality and climate issues and not the construction part of it so much. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. Thank you again to Skanska for sponsoring this event and making this possible. We look forward to having all of you join us in a real big celebration of our 50th anniversary on June 17th. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Friday.